Here we are again. Good morning to you, and thank you for joining today's lesson. I hope everyone's had a good, happy, safe 4th of July. Today, our lesson is from session 5 in our quarterly, or if you don't have that, it's going to be mostly from Proverbs chapter 5. The lesson is titled Following God's Design, and the concentration in this lesson is following God's design for sexuality. Marriage, where sexual activity is to be solely contained, is a gift from God for the man and woman that He created. It's a way that they can share their lives and have intimate companionship. It's also a way to reveal the faithful union and the relationship between Christ and His church. In the Old Testament, the prophets a lot of time compared Israel's disloyalty to God with an imagery of a broken marriage relationship. Now, if we build a house and we fail to follow the blueprints, and I surely don't know anything about reading blueprints, the house could very well end in a disaster. Unless you are a master builder, you know all the ins and outs of construction, and you can build from memory and experience. And if you successfully build a house and you never maintain it, then it's going to begin to crumble and fall. A house requires a constant upkeep. And marriage is a lot like building a house. It has a blueprint too, and it has some guidelines and building instructions, and they're found in the scriptures, and many of them are found in the book of Proverbs. So after the I do's, unless you already know the ins and outs of marriage construction, which, by the way, is impossible because the dynamics between two people constantly change. Some days you're the giver, and some days you're the taker, and some days you just there. But there is a molding and a meshing together to allow for the constant changes within a marriage bond. And therefore, with the changes, with the ebb and the flow from day to day, it's wise to follow the instructions that have been proven by God, and they give the acceptable and unacceptable behaviors of a husband and wife toward each other. Once the marriage is established, maintenance is also imperative for the upkeep, just like the upkeep of a building. Every day we start a new journey, and following God's design yesterday does not guarantee that we'll follow Him today. It would be nice, remember, if we had those spiritual blinders and if we were blindly led down God's pathway, but we're not. We have choices. And Solomon knew this all too well. The young men that were being trained in wisdom were given specific instructions concerning sexual behavior inside and outside the confines of marriage. And the warning spanned from chapter 5 all the way through chapter 7. Now, next week, we'll be in chapter 8 for the lesson. So, in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5, Solomon once again urged his son to pay attention to his instructions. Now, it would be nice, let's take a classroom, a school classroom. If the teacher on the first day of school said, now, I'm going to give you some instructions and I'm going to teach you, and I want you to pay attention. And that's the only time they ever had to say that. That would be great. Or when we have our children, if we warn them about the dangers of when they go out in the yard to play, and we only do it one time because that's all it takes, that would be great. But we have to keep reiterating the instructions to listen up, pay attention, follow these instructions. And that's what Solomon did. And it seems like all the time we're reading and he's saying, okay, I want you to listen to what I'm saying. I want you to adhere to these instructions. But he was encouraging them to listen just like we do over and over. It was important for them to hear. But he also at this time encouraged them to let these instructions go through their lips. In other words, pass the instructions along to others, and ultimately the future generations could benefit from these same instructions. And although teaching to the young males was the dominant reason for his writing these proverbs, his instructions are just as applicable to young women, and not just young women, but older women, older men, people of all ages and all generations. And they're just as pertinent now as they were at the time that they were taught, from that day all the way to this very day. Now, so for today's lesson, we're going to begin in verse 3. It says, "For the lips of the strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life, her ways are movable that thou canst not know them." In these verses, the strange woman was a forbidden one. And it could have been a woman forbidden outside of marriage. It could have been a woman forbidden even if you weren't married. But she was a forbidden one, and she was one who gave no consideration to the path that she had chosen for herself. And she certainly did not care for the safety or the integrity of the ones that she tried to lure into her web. She was deceiving others, but she was deceiving herself. Solomon had previously warned his sons about other groups of people, young people, who would walk a sinful path, and they weren't concerned with themselves, with the end result of their choices, the gains that he spoke of. And they may try to get the young men to join in with their lifestyle, and they painted a pretty picture with a life filled with some easily gained wealth. And remember, they said, "Oh, we're going to get all the things that the loot that we get, and we're going to share it equally with everyone. So you just join up with us." It was a false picture that they painted. The words from this woman's mouth were sweet as honey, which was the sweetest substance of that day. It may be the sweetest substance of this day. We do have refined sugar, and maybe that, per ounce might be a little more sweeter. But anyway, at that time, honey was the sweetest substance, and olive oil was the smoothest. Her words painted a beautiful picture with promises of gratification and physical pleasure. This part of Proverbs is specific to sexual sins, but the description can also be applied to any sin. Temptation of any sort does not present itself with bad outcome. It is alluring. It's promising something worthy and beautiful, just like this woman in these verses. It's full of flattery that makes it hard to resist. It can start with just a glimpse, or one word, or one innocent touch, or one little thought. This woman's promises may have led to believe that she offered a lasting pleasure, but it was short-lived. So Solomon then explained how the short-term pleasure turns to bitterness and horrible consequences. The wormwood was a bitter shrub, and the double-edged sword could stab and slash. And those who were caught up in this flattery of false promises, and it may start out with sweetness in a so-called good life, but it was going to end in bitterness and misery. But the worst outcome is that her path leads to death. Solomon warned about the paths that we could choose in life. There was one that got designed by God. It was a straight road that was safe, and it was easily traveled. Or there was another road that was curvy and dangerous with lots of pitfalls, and it led away from God. This was the aftermath of following the lures of this woman, or the lures of other temptations. In verses 7 and 8, it says, "Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh to the door of her house." When we ignore God's wisdom, we take the first step down the wrong road. May not have moved in that direction yet, but when we ignore the wisdom and the instructions of God, that's our first step. We head ourselves straight for misery and regret. And Solomon urged his sons to just stay away from her door. In chapter 7, he tells of witnessing a young man being lured into the house of a woman with persuasive words. He said the young man followed her like an ox going. It was like an ox going into the going into slaughter. I'm sorry, I lost my place in my notes. I write all over this book. Or it could be a deer stepping into a noose. They might be lured there by food, but they have no idea what's in store for them. And Solomon knew the best way to avoid crossing the line of temptation would be to avoid any slight possibility of coming in contact with it. So he urged his sons not to go near. Don't give temptation a glance or even a quick thought. Don't go near it. If you know you're going to be tempted by something, just stay away. If you know that you don't need to eat desserts, well, then don't have any in your house. That's my weakness. If you know that you don't need ice cream, don't go to the ice cream shop. If I know I don't need to eat dessert, I don't need to go to Villani's in Charlotte because I'm going to have a piece of cheesecake or just, I can't help it. So I stay away. Don't go. And that's exactly what he urged his sons. Don't even go near a place where you might be tempted. And then in verses 9 through 11, he says, lest thou give thine honor unto others and thy years unto the cruel, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. The strangers here may have been relatives of the woman or her other sex partners, or in today's world, or maybe in that world too, they might be human traffickers that lure people into their web or into their situation. They may be like that deer that's caught in the noose, but they had a goal. They had an ulterior motive, and that was to gain the wealth of their victims and what they had worked for. Because he said here, what you've labored for is going to be in the house of someone else. It's going to be in the house of a stranger. But the final note is that succumbing to this woman's seductions was going to drain the victim of their self-respect, their time, their money, and wealth. It says in the very first part, lest thou give thine honor unto others. You're giving up your honor, your self-respect, your time, your money, your health. Nothing would be left but an empty shell. It says, thy flesh and thy body are consumed. There'd be an empty shell of a person who had once had vitality and energy and a great potential in life. And it was used, wasted. This person now lives with anguish and humiliation and regret of a life that was wasted on immediate gratification rather than pursuing a lasting peace. God created us, and the Bible does not hide the fact that we were created with sexual desires. So the next verses explain the enjoyment of that gift within the confines of God's design. So I'm going to read all of the verses 15 through 18. If you have that book, you see they're separated. But it says in verse 15, drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. In these verses, Solomon used water as an analogy for sexual intimacy within a marriage. Water was a precious commodity in the desert area. It was life-saving. Our bodies need it for hydration in order to survive. We wouldn't want to, but we could survive 2 or 3 weeks without food, or at least I've read that. I've not tried it. But without water, we can only last for a few days. But not just any water is good for the body. Now, there's some water here at my house in the ditch out in front of the yard, and it's got water in it all the time. But I'm certainly not going to drink it. And I'm not even sure that some wild animal or an animal outside would be safe to drink it. It's not pure. The pure water of Solomon's day was rainwater that was collected in cisterns or pits that were dug into rocks that would keep the water safe for longer periods of time. Or the water came from a well with a natural spring. And I'm sure some of you have stopped by the road sometimes where there was a natural spring and had a taste of that water. In either case, the water belonged to one family, like a family well from earlier days in our country. Some of you might remember a well that had a bucket and you had to pull the water up with the bucket. I don't remember that, but I do remember having a well, but then we got a pump that pumped the water up for us. But Solomon warned his sons to drink the water from their own resources, their own cisterns, or their own well. In other words, or to find sexual fulfillment only in the context of their own marriage relationship. Sometimes in the rainy season, there would be floodwaters that flowed into the streets. But people they kept these waters in their cisterns clean. They didn't utilize these waters that overflowed in the storm. Verse 16 was really a rhetorical question, and it should have been read like, "Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of water in the streets." In other words, would you let your fountains, in other words, would you pour your cistern waters out into the streets or into the public square? And the answer, of course, was no. That would be a foolish action. That water in your privately owned cistern was reserved for your household. And what Solomon was really asking, is it wise? Would it be wise, or would it be right, or would it be good for the sexual intimacy intended for marriage to flow out of control and out of bounds anywhere it wanted, like the floodwaters from a sudden storm? And his warnings to his sons had already answered that question. But this safe water didn't just happen. The Israelites had to make personal commitments and efforts to have a reliable source of fresh water. The water didn't just appear for them. They had to dig the cisterns and protect the integrity of the water's freshness from the overflows from storms. And they had to keep their fountains, where they had a natural spring water, they had to maintain that. And they had to also have the blessings of God's rainy season. So they didn't have rain every day or every other day like we do around here. They had a season that was rain, and they had to store it up. And that was a blessing from God. Good, godly marriages don't just happen either. They require commitment and faithfulness and include the expression of physical intimacy. By using the blueprint for building that type of marriage, then we give God the opportunity to bless it beyond what newlyweds on that special day could begin to imagine. Before starting most projects in our life, and marriage is a project, it's much more than the wedding, but I bet as soon as someone sets a wedding date, the woman probably buys a magazine that guides her instructions about how to plan a wedding or what a wedding entails. So for that project, for any project in life, we need to read the instructions first. And Solomon was trying to give his sons a jump start on a fulfilling marriage relationship with others. Solomon has addressed that in previous chapters about people, that how we interact with people, because if we have a good relationship with God, that leads us to have good relationships with other people and how we interact and treat other people in general. But that also speaks to how we have our interactions within our marriages. When we have a good relationship with God, then we should take those qualities that He encourages us for interaction with others, and our spouses should be the first recipient of that. It should be designed with love and kindness and humility and integrity and politeness. Our spouses should be the first ones who get the good results of a good relationship with God. Now, we get to the time for self-reflection. This lesson focused on sexual sins, but I believe the warnings can be applied to any and all temptations. And I've tried to research in Solomon's life when he wrote this particular Proverbs, because in his life he did succumb to sins of the flesh. And I wondered if he wrote these instructions as a result of that and based on his personal experience, or if it was before the time that was spoken of in 1 Kings 11. But I'm going to read a section of 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. And I warn you ahead of time, I may say some words incorrectly, but I think it's pretty important to read this for this lesson today. So this is 1 Kings chapter 11. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth, which was probably arranged marriages, and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives. Remember the word strange woman, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So, in self-evaluation, I read this because temptation of any sort is seductive and dangerous because it starts very small and seemingly so innocent, but it has the ability to spread like a destructive wildfire. Solomon built those temples to those false gods near Jerusalem. He had built the temple in Jerusalem. David was not allowed to build the temple because he was a warrior king. Solomon was allowed to build the temple of God, to put the Holy of the Holies, the Ark of the Covenant. But then he was led astray by these strange women, by their temptations, and built temples or places of worship for false gods. So I ask you now, are there some little red flags of sin that just whish around in your head? Because it usually starts with a thought. Do you toy around with specks of infidelity to not just your spouse, but maybe because it's not just the sexual intimacy, but all sins, maybe some other person, such as a boss or a co-worker, or just are you living a life of integrity? But more importantly, do you flit around and flirt around with infidelities to God? Just remember these verses from 1 Kings, that the man that was given more wisdom than any other fell short of the design that God had for him. Solomon kept urging his sons to hold fast to the wise instruction, to keep it close to his heart, and to stay away from luring sights of temptations. Solomon's instructions are just as urgent for each of us today as they were the day that he taught them in his royal courts. I want to thank you for joining once more, and I know that you're all praying. We all are praying for our country. And I'd like to add one more prayer to your list, if I may. One of Morgan's good friends, Jenna and Tim Cools, have 3 little boys. Mason, I think, is turning 6 this weekend. Sawyer is just maybe 2. He's a little older than Savannah. But the middle son, Levi, he's about 6 months older than Scarlett, was taken to the doctor Tuesday. He had some strange looking bruises on his legs, which, children get bruises, and this particular child's very rambunctious, and Scarlett gets bruises and Savannah gets bruises, but they were strange looking. And she took him to the doctor Tuesday. He was diagnosed with leukemia. I think it might be an aggressive type of leukemia. I'm not even going to attempt to say the name of it, but he was put in the hospital at Duke that very day. And the plan is that he would stay there for a month. He's already had 1 chemo treatment since Tuesday. But the good news is today, Jenna posted a picture and said that because of his lab work, they were able to move him out of the intensive care unit and into a regular room. But this little boy is facing a month in the hospital. And then I think the plan is a weekly visit for some time, but they talk like it will be maybe a 3-year journey. He's a strong little fella, and Jenna and Tim are relying on the prayers of God's people to get them through this. So I thank you once again for listening today, and I pray that something that's been said will encourage and bless your spirit. I know it'll be great when we can talk about a lesson instead of me just doing all the talking. That's kind of hard. But until then, I'll be back here, and I hope you'll be back here too. Thank you, and have a blessed week. And now let me see if I can find this crazy thing to stop this recording.